Hello and welcome to another video by Econo Insight. This video is part 2 of aggregate supply curves. If you have not watched part 1, I recommend you to watch it or else you'll have a hard time understanding this video. So now, let's combine the short run aggregate supply with the long run aggregate supply. We know from part 1 of the video that short run aggregate supply is in the form of a horizontal curve. Why? Because prices are sticky in the short run, and in the long run, since output is not dependent of in prices in the long run, so the long run aggregate supply is vertical. And now we can see the combination of this. And let's say we draw an aggregate demand curve, a downward sloping aggregate demand curve here. We can label the intersection of these three curves as what we know by the long run equilibrium. So this is a basic combination and you should know. And now let's run the scenarios on what will happen if there is a reduction in aggregate demand or an increase in aggregate demand. How does that play out in the economy? So now, this is our model, and if there is an increase in aggregate demand, what is the cause of the increase in aggregate demand? In this case, some of you may ask, maybe, I don't know for whatever possible reason, maybe, for example, the government conducts expansionary fiscal policy, or the government increases money supply, which is a form of easy monetary policy. So whatever reason, the government there is an increase in aggregate demand from 80 to 81. So that shifts the 80 curve rightwards. We can see that in the short run, since prices are sticky, this will only result in an economic boom, just temporary economic boom in the society. But however, this will then generate an upward pressure, right, towards the LR's curve, and which will result to higher prices in the economy in the long run. But notice here, in the long run, there are higher prices, but the output is the same like the initial output. So we can conclude that if there is an increase in aggregate demand, then it will increase output in the short run, but it just merely affects the price level only in the long run, not the output in the long run. So that's a very important distinction and analysis to make. And now let's flip the scenario. If we start with the same aggregate demand curve, and let's say there is a decrease in aggregate demand, again, for whatever reason, maybe the government now conducts contractionary fiscal policy, or the government conducts tight monetary policy, which essentially means reducing the money supply. That all can result in a reduction in aggregate demand. So let's say there's a reduction in aggregate demand, and the 80 curve shifts from 80 to 81. We can see that it lowers output in the short run. One second. It lowers output in the short run since prices are sticky in the short run, right? So notice my arrows there. It lowers output in the short run, but in the long run, right? In the long run, it merely reduces prices, right? Since again, in the long run, the output is not dependent on the price level. So we can conclude here that if there's a reduction in aggregate demand in the economy, then it will lower the output in the short run, but it will only affect the price level by reducing the price level in the long run. So that is the demand shocks on how it will play out in the economy. But now, what if there is a supply shock? Again, the supply shock is something that is different than a demand shock. So number one, if it's a supply shock, we must not do anything with the aggregate demand curve, since that relates to the demand. So now if there's a supply shock, let's say oil prices increase. I'm going to put it down here. Oil prices increase. Then there will be an upward shift of the SARS curve, short-run aggregate supply curve, from SARS1 to SARS2, right? And notice here that our aggregate demand curve does not shift at all. But since the prices in the short run increase, there will be an increase in the price in the short run, and this will result to a lower output. But notice here that the aggregate, again, very important distinction, the aggregate demand curve does not shift, but in this case, the supply shock results to moving along in the aggregate demand curve. That is a very important distinction to make, and I hope you now understand the combination of the short-term aggregate supply and the long-run aggregate supply, and analyzing demand shocks, an increase in aggregate demand, a reduction in aggregate demand, and also a supply shock. Thank you for watching.